I'm Cullen Bunn. I am the writer of Reanimator, The Eternal Lie. I'm also the writer of a number of comics like The Six Gun, Harrow County, Basilisk, Door to Door, Night by Night, and many, many others.
I'm Blacky Shepherd. I'm the artist for Reanimator: The Eternal Lie, both volumes 1 and 2. I've worked on a number of projects for Dynamite. I've worked on some Vampirella versus Reanimator with Cullen. We did Pumpkinhead and we did Voltron together. Um, and I've also done, some GI Joe, some Transformers, that kind of thing.
Reanimator The Eternal Lie is a direct sequel to the original short story that H.P. Lovecraft wrote about Herbert West. We've taken it in some very different directions, though. In the first volume of Reanimator The Eternal Lie, we find that someone has stolen Herbert West's reanimation serum, and they are planning on using that for a nefarious purpose. As the story progresses, we find out that purpose is not just nefarious in scale, it's cosmic in scale. So in Reanimator: The Eternal Lie Part 2, we see where that's going. We will have learned some big secrets about Herbert West himself, and we will learn some big secrets about his enemies. And in Part 2, we get to see how that plays out in a cataclysmic way.
When the idea for this project first came up, Cullen described it to me. He said, yeah, we're going to do a direct sequel to the original short stories, Herbert West Reanimator that H.P. Lovecraft wrote. And my immediate thought was, he got torn to pieces at the end of that story. There's very little Herbert West left. And Cullen reassured me that, he had that handled. And in fact, he did.
I tried to keep that secret from Blacky as long as I possibly could. What
right.
the revelations on that.
Well, it's that whole thing. It takes us all the way to the very end, literally the last page of volume 1. And Cullen is the type of writer that, as much as I might beg him, he wasn't given anything. I'd send him texts or we'd talk on the phone or whatever, and he wasn't given any hints as to what the setup might be, until I got the script for that section of the book, and then of course it's a big cliffhanger, which then leads us into volume 2.
For me, I had to be in 7th or 8th grade when I discovered. I don't even remember which publisher it was anymore. I just call them the silver editions, because there was this line of Lovecraft collections that came out, and they all had these great Michael Whelan covers, and they all sort of had a gray tone to them or a silver tone to them. And I found those at a Walden Books or something, just randomly browsing. You couldn't turn those covers away. They were compelling. And then they released like a really like an oversized trade paperback collection of stories. And so it was all in that era, 6th or 7th grade. Up until that point, I'd heard the name Lovecraft from, some friends and older kids. And I even think I probably had that weird paperback that you could get in the New Age section of Walden Books, the Necronomicon paperback. I'm pretty sure I had that before I ever read an H.P. Lovecraft story. But then once I read them, I was hooked. I even then at a young age, I really I liked the imagination that went into those stories. I don't think they were necessarily well-written stories. I think they weren't well-written stories, but I do think the imagination is hard to deny, and that feeling of cosmic dread is something that appealed to me. And then it just blew out from there. And it's not even about Lovecraft for me. It's about the circle of writers who have just expanded and expanded and expanded on the mythos. And most of the time, my favorite stories are written by people like Robert Bloch and Ramsey Campbell. and they're in that same sort of cosmic mythology, but they're not written by Lovecraft. And Robert E. Howard wrote some really cool fringe Lovecraftian, Cthulhu mythos type stories.
Yeah, I went through a similarly kind of circuitous way. So, my love of horror started really young, but it was primarily movies, and I think I saw the Reanimator film long before I knew who H.P. Lovecraft was. I saw it in probably fifth grade, maybe sixth grade, way too young for that kind of film. Um, and it said H.P. Lovecraft on it, but that didn't really register much with me. I was just kind of generally aware of what would eventually, coalesce in my mind as the work of H.P. Lovecraft. And then I guess, but I was really deep into Robert E. Howard stuff. I'd read all the Conan books. I'd read a lot of the Solomon Kane stuff, and then I'd read some, what's his name, Clark Ashton.
Clark
Is that his
Ashton.
name?
Yeah. Clark Ashton.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd read a couple of his things, not really knowing that it was tied to Lovecraft. And then because I'd read a lot of kind of pulp novels, and then in it must have been seventh grade, I read It by Stephen King. And it is a very Lovecraftian novel, and the entities in it are very Lovecraftian in kind of tone. And so that, reading that and talking to friends of mine who are also into Stephen King, we started kind of bandying it about, and the name Lovecraft kept popping up. And, I just kind of vaguely knew who he was. And then, just like Cullen, and it was a Walden Books, I was rolling through the horror section, and there were those silver edition, like, with the Michael Whelan covers. And I remember the specific one. It's the one where it's got the guy in the kind of he's wearing like a robe, and he's holding the robe open,
He's
and
holding
his
it open.
skeleton,
Yeah.
and that was just like an instant buy. And it was like, oh, this is H.P. Lovecraft. And I started reading it, and the first story really that got me was not Herbert West Reanimator. It was, oh, I think it was called The Stranger. Is that the one where he's basically, you follow this guy who he's like underground, and he's looking into this castle where they're having this very opulent party, and then suddenly everybody in the party starts freaking out and bolts, and then you realize, he looks in the mirror, and you realize that he's a monster, and he's kind of, shown up and scared everybody. I think it was called The Stranger. And that one really grabbed me. So then, of course, I plowed through the rest of that volume, got all the rest of the volumes, and then I read Herbert West Reanimator, which, compared to the film, the short stories are pretty different. There are certain beats that occur, but of course, the film is much updated. It's set in a modern era for the time, whereas the short stories were set, what, in the 30s.
Right. I don't know how I met Blacky. I've blocked that out of my memory.
You and everybody else. So when I first worked for Dynamite, on a Vampirella anthology called Fairy Tales, I did a little 6 or 7 page work, written by Stuart Moore, and that was my first work in comics. And I'm not gonna lie, those pages weren't great. They were very much training wheels pages. So I kind of, after I finished turning them in, I kind of thought, well, okay, I guess that was my journey in comics, But then the editor at the time sent me an email and said, hey, it was the weirdest email, because it's almost like she thought I was going to turn it down, which is crazy. But she said, hey, I've got this script by Cullen Bunn for a Voltron comic. Is that something you'd be interested in? And I had already read Sixth Gun. There was something else that I read. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I knew who Cullen was, and I was a big fan, especially of Sixth Gun. And so I jumped at the chance, and so we did Voltron. and then after we finished Voltron, a little bit of time went by, and then I was actually on my way home from San Diego Comic-Con one year, and I think it was Cullen sent me a text asking me if I would be interested in drawing the Pumpkinhead comic. And of course, being a huge Stan Winston nerd and Pumpkinhead nerd, and I was really interested to do some horror with Cullen, because horror is kind of my bread and butter, and he's such a good and prolific writer of horror that I was kind of just waiting to work on a horror project. So when he sent me that text, I immediately jumped at it.
I'm pretty sure when I sent you that message, that project hadn't been greenlit. I was just
really?
It was going to happen. So
right.
I was manifesting it into reality. Well, what's interesting about our Herbert West, and I don't know that this is the Herbert West that was portrayed in the original short story. Really, this is this story is really our interpretation of that character and taking him to the next logical or illogical steps. And the Herbert West in this book, what's interesting about him is he's not a nice guy. He's not a hero. I mean, it's not too much of a stretch to say Herbert West's a bit of a dirtbag. But
yeah, he's a liar and a villain, basically.
He's a villain. And he's interesting to me because he's a man. He would never say he has faith, really. He's not a man of faith, but he does have faith in science and the degrees to which he can push science and where he can take it and what he can and how he can control his own God, this God of science. He can control it, which is really what every really religious person wants to do. They want to control their God. That's the true nature of it. So we took that idea with Herbert West and we just really ran with it. And what I think is really cool about him in this story is, as Blacky said, he's a villain, but he's pushed into taking on what is essentially a heroic role and going up against something that is more terrible than him. And I really like how we can play against it's no secret that we are really pulling in a lot of cosmic deities into this story. And it's interesting to see how we can play this concept of cosmic deities and West's own deification of his own science. And I think that's a really cool, they're really cool forces to play against one another.
I was really interested in the way that Herbert West, at first he, in this story in volume 1, he comes across as kind of this wounded and crossed guy, right, who has been betrayed by his former lover, and he comes kind of hat in hand to the narrator, asking for his help, and the narrator, rightly, because he's one of the few people that knows anything about Herbert West, is a little bit not sure whether or not he needs to help. But Herbert West kind of spells out the stakes in such a way that he's kind of trapped in it. He kind of has to help Herbert West. And what I really liked about it was, like Cullen said, Herbert West's God is science. And I think part of it, and I might just be reading into it here, but part of it, and it gets fleshed out towards the end of volume 1 and very much in volume 2, is that if Herbert West's God is science, then Herbert West sees himself as kind of the Jesus of science, the person that's bringing that to the unwashed masses. And then he is able to, one of the things that I think speaks to him is, he's involved now with these, space deities for all intents and purposes, but they're deities that he can see and touch and react to and interact with and manipulate. And so that gives him a level of power that you know, one who is involved strictly in a religious sense with deities that are kind of amorphous or theoretical in nature. They don't have that wherewithal, whereas Herbert West very much does. That through line actually made its way into our Vampirella versus Reanimator story, because again, there he's a villain. You know, he's looking to perfect his formula. He doesn't care what happens in the process of getting to the perfection of his formula. And because of his absolute lust and desire, and one might say religious fervor to do so, he involves himself with something that is well outside of his control and gets sucked into doing something just horribly bad. And so, you know, one thing that I really like is, though these two stories are not very canonically attached to one another, Herbert West is very much a consistent character between them. And I've always really liked the character of Herbert West, and really love our version of that character, because he is a villain. He's not apologetic about it. He will absolutely do whatever he needs to do to progress his own interests, and his interests are essentially scientific based necromorphism, which, you know, you can't go wrong with that. That is horror fodder of the highest order. I say this a lot when I on the projects that I work with Cullen on, but it's absolutely true. Even if I weren't drawing this book, I would still be super hyped for this book, because it's so good. You know, the first volume ends on such a crushing cliffhanger, that, you know, you just kind of have to dive into volume two, and it pays off that cliffhanger so well and in such a dynamic way that, you know, it's something that I'm most proud of that I've worked on. And the Kickstarter gives you the ability to get the first volume. There's, you know, a huge number of covers. There's, you know, and stretch goals to be announced, as I understand.
That's the biggest thing for me, is if you weren't able to back the campaign for volume one, and I've seen a lot of people have asked me, can I, you know, I didn't get volume one, what do I do? It's easy. You can get volume one and volume two together right in this campaign. So even though the campaign's for volume two, you can get the entire story right here.